An elderly man, dressed in a plain button-up shirt and scuffed shoes, quietly stepped into a busy Macdonald's during lunchtime rush hour. The smell of sizzling fries and the hum of the crowd filled the air. He walked slowly to the counter, his hands slightly trembling as he reached for his wallet. The line behind him was growing, and impatient customers muttered under their breath. The young waiter at the counter, wearing a crisp uniform but a smug expression, rolled his eyes. "What can I get for you?" he asked sharply, tapping his pen against the register. The elderly man smiled softly, his voice calm but weathered. "Just a simple cheeseburger and a coffee, please." The waiter raised an eyebrow, scanning the man's appearance, his worn clothes, his slow mannerisms. With a condescending smirk, he leaned forward. "Are you sure you can afford that? We don't serve meals on credit here, old man." The room fell silent for a moment, as a few heads turned toward the scene. The elderly man's smile faltered, but he didn't react with anger. Instead, he calmly handed over the exact change for his order. The waiter snatched the money and muttered under his breath, "Waste of time," before slamming the register shut. As the man waited for his food, a group of younger staff at the back began whispering and laughing, their eyes darting toward him. The disrespect was palpable, but the elderly man remained composed. When his tray was finally slammed onto the counter, he nodded politely, took his food, and found a seat in the corner. Minutes later, the restaurant manager, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, entered the room, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted the elderly man, and her face lit up with recognition. Immediately, she rushed over to his table, her tone respectful and warm. "Mr. Henderson, I didn't know you were coming today." The young waiter froze mid-conversation, his smug grin vanishing as he turned toward the manager's voice. He watched, wide-eyed, as the elderly man smiled warmly at the manager. "I like to drop in unannounced sometimes," the man said kindly, taking a sip of his coffee. "It helps me see how things are really running." The room went quiet as the realization set in. Mr. Henderson wasn't just an ordinary customer. He was the CEO of the entire franchise. The young waiter's face turned pale as the weight of his actions sank in. He stumbled forward, trying to stammer out an apology. "Sir, I didn't realize." The elderly man raised a hand, silencing him with a calm but firm gaze. "It shouldn't matter who I am," he said, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. "Every customer deserves respect, whether they're in a suit or plain clothes." The manager's expression darkened as she turned to the waiter. "We'll discuss this in my office," she said sharply before addressing the elderly man again. "Mr. Henderson, I deeply apologize for this behavior. It won't happen again." The elderly man nodded, finishing his meal quietly as the staff scrambled to correct their demeanor. By the time he left, the entire restaurant had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Humility and respect are values that should never be compromised, no matter who's standing in line. As Mr. Henderson stepped out of the Macdonald's, the air outside was crisp, and the sounds of bustling traffic filled the street. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. The young waiter, now sitting in the manager's office, fidgeted nervously. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, the elderly man's calm demeanor, the weight of his words. He hadn't just disrespected a customer. He had insulted the CEO of the company. The manager entered the office, her expression stern. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "I didn't know who he was," the waiter stammered, his face pale. I thought he was just some old man." The manager sighed, crossing her arms. "And that's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter who he was. Everyone who walks through that door deserves respect. Mr. Henderson built this company on that principle. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson walked toward his car, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood by the door, looking back at the restaurant, his mind racing. He had seen too many instances like this. Young employees who forgot the importance of treating people with dignity. It was a flaw he knew needed addressing at the core of his company's culture. Back in the office, the manager leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. "You're young, and I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you can learn from this, but you'll need to earn back trust. Mine and Mr. Henderson's." The waiter nodded quickly, his voice trembling. "I'll do anything. I'll work harder. I'll prove I can do better." The manager considered him for a moment, then gave him a firm nod. "Good. You'll start by apologizing to Mr. Henderson directly, and after that, you'll be reassigned to cleaning duties for the next month. Let's see if humility comes easier when you're scrubbing floors." As the young waiter gulped and nodded, Mr. Henderson re-entered the restaurant. The entire staff fell silent, their eyes fixed on him as he approached the counter. The manager motioned for the waiter to step forward. The young man hesitated, then stepped out from behind the counter. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Henderson, I'm so sorry for the way I treated you. I was rude and disrespectful, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'll do better." Mr. Henderson looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small, kind smile, he spoke. "Apologies mean nothing without actions to back them up. Let's see what you do moving forward." The waiter nodded earnestly, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and determination. Mr. Henderson turned to the rest of the staff, addressing them in a calm but authoritative tone. "Let today be a reminder. It's not enough to serve food quickly or efficiently. True success comes from treating every customer with respect, no matter who they are. That's the foundation of this company, and I expect every one of you to uphold it." The staff murmured their agreement, the lesson sinking in deeply. As Mr. Henderson finally left the restaurant, the young waiter glanced at the floor mop, leaning against the wall. He knew he had a long way to go to redeem himself, but for the first time, he felt ready to take the challenge seriously. Outside, Mr. Henderson got into his car, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had taught another important lesson that day, not just about respect, but about accountability and growth. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had built his company in the first place. Weeks passed since the incident, and the young waiter, Brian, found himself reassigned to cleaning and assisting other employees behind the scenes. The initial humiliation stung deeply, especially when his coworkers avoided eye contact or whispered behind his back. Yet, Mr. Henderson's words echoed in his mind. Apologies mean nothing without actions to back them up. Determined to prove he had learned his lesson, Brian threw himself into his new role with humility. He scrubbed floors until they shined, cleaned tables with precision, and volunteered to help in the kitchen during rush hours. At first, the staff watched skeptically, waiting for him to slip back into his old arrogance. But as days turned into weeks, something began to shift. Brian wasn't just doing his job. He was doing it with sincerity and care. One afternoon, as he cleaned the outdoor patio, Brian noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry her tray to a table. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said with a genuine smile. The woman's face lit up as she thanked him, and for the first time, Brian felt the satisfaction of treating someone with kindness, simply because it was the right thing to do. Inside the restaurant, the manager observed quietly, a small smile playing on her lips. She had noticed Brian's efforts and knew that something in him had changed. He wasn't just trying to impress anyone anymore. He was growing. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson hadn't forgotten the incident. He had been keeping tabs on Brian's progress through the manager's updates. One day, he decided to pay another unannounced visit. Dressed in his usual understated attire, he entered the restaurant unnoticed and sat at a corner table. He watched as Brian moved between tasks, assisting customers and cleaning with quiet diligence. There was no trace of the smug, disrespectful young man Mr. Henderson had encountered weeks ago. After finishing his meal, Mr. Henderson approached the counter. Brian, busy wiping down a nearby table, froze as he saw the familiar face. His heart raced, but instead of fear, he felt a deep need to show Mr. Henderson the person he was becoming. "Mr. Henderson," Brian said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself. I've been working hard to make things right." Mr. Henderson studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "I can see that, Brian," he said. "Growth isn't about perfection. It's about effort. And you've been putting in the effort." The manager joined them, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Brian's been doing an excellent job. The customers love him now, and he's become an asset to the team." Brian's face flushed with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I'll keep working hard, sir, I promise." Mr. Henderson placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "Keep that attitude and you'll go far, not just in this job, but in life." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "And remember, it's never too late to start building a better reputation." As Mr. Henderson left the restaurant that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment. The lesson had been taught, the growth had been witnessed, and the values he had built his company on were once again reinforced. For Brian, the experience had become a turning point, not just in his job, but in his life. Months later, Brian stood behind the counter once again, this time as the assistant manager. His co-workers respected him, and the customers often praised his kindness and professionalism. The incident that had once humiliated him had transformed him, leaving behind a valuable lesson he would carry forever. Respect isn't about status. It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are. As the months rolled by, Brian's transformation became the heart of the restaurant's story. Regular customers noticed the shift in atmosphere. A place once filled with tension now radiated warmth and camaraderie. Brian's leadership as assistant manager didn't just focus on efficiency. He prioritized the culture of respect that Mr. Henderson had emphasized. One particular day stood out. The restaurant was busier than ever, and a young boy, barely 6 years old, wandered in with his grandfather. The boy looked nervous as he held his grandfather's hand, who, like Mr. Henderson months ago, appeared unassuming in his simple clothes. They approached the counter, their eyes scanning the vibrant menu. Brian was nearby, supervising the floor, when he noticed the new guests. He immediately stepped in to greet them with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon. How can we make your day better today?" he asked, his tone kind and inviting. The young boy hesitated, tugging at his grandfather's sleeve. "Do we have enough money, Grandpa?" he whispered, unaware that Brian could hear him. The elderly man smiled gently and nodded. "Yes, we do, little one. Don't worry." Brian felt a wave of emotion sweep over him. The scene reminded him of how quickly he had judged Mr. Henderson all those months ago, and how he might have hurt countless others with his arrogance. Determined to make a difference, he leaned closer. "You know what? Lunch is on us today. Consider it a thank you for bringing such great company into our restaurant." The boy's face lit up with joy, and his grandfather's eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thank you, young man. the elderly man said, his voice thick with emotion. Not many people take the time to show kindness these days. As Brian prepared their meal himself, the staff watched, inspired by his actions. They had seen how far he had come and how his journey had impacted everyone around him. That evening, as the restaurant closed, Brian sat with the manager, reflecting on the day. "You've come a long way, Brian," she said, her voice warm. "From the guy who thought respect was optional to the man teaching all of us what it really means." Brian smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "I think back to that day with Mr. Henderson a lot. I was so focused on myself that I forgot what it meant to truly serve people. He didn't just give me a second chance. He gave me a new perspective." The manager nodded. "You've honored that second chance, and now you're helping others do the same." Not long after, Mr. Henderson returned to the restaurant for another unannounced visit. This time, he found a thriving team led by a young man he barely recognized, the confident yet humble Brian, who now commanded respect, not through fear, but through example. "Brian," Mr. Henderson said after a quiet observation of the restaurant's new atmosphere, "I think it's time we talked about your future." Brian blinked, his heart pounding. "My future, sir?" Mr. Henderson smiled. "You've turned this place around, and you've shown the kind of leadership this company needs. How would you feel about managing a new location? One where you can build this same culture from the ground up?" Brian was speechless for a moment, but then a wide grin spread across his face. "I'd be honored, sir, truly honored." As Brian accepted the new role, he carried the lessons he had learned with him: humility, kindness, and the power of a second chance. And as for Mr. Henderson, he knew his company was in good hands, entrusted to a generation that had learned to value the humanity behind every interaction. Together, they proved that respect, when nurtured, could transform not just people, but entire communities. Brian stood outside the restaurant one last time, taking in the place that had become more than a workplace. It was where he had rediscovered himself. The neon sign buzzed softly above, and the warm hum of the bustling crowd inside reminded him of how far he had come. Tonight was his final shift before he left to manage his new location, a milestone that seemed impossible just months ago. Inside, the staff had gathered to surprise him with a farewell party. Balloons and a small banner reading, "Thank you, Brian," hung near the counter. Employees, both new and old, shared stories of how his kindness and leadership had inspired them. Customers chimed in, recalling moments when Brian had gone out of his way to make their day better. When the chatter died down, the restaurant manager handed Brian a microphone. "Brian, you've taught us all so much, not just about hard work, but about respect and second chances. We are so proud of you. Would you like to say a few words before you leave?" Brian hesitated, emotions swirling in his chest. He looked around at the faces of the people who had witnessed his transformation, the ones who had believed in him even when he doubted himself. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "I don't think I could have imagined standing here a year ago," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first started here, I thought respect was something people owed me, not something I had to earn. That was my biggest mistake. Mr. Henderson didn't just teach me a lesson that day. He gave me a second chance. And it's because of that second chance that I stand here today." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This restaurant taught me what it means to serve people with kindness, no matter who they are or where they come from. I've seen what respect can do. It doesn't just change individuals. It changes communities. That's the lesson I'll take with me wherever I go." Applause erupted, and Brian stepped down, his heart full. As the crowd mingled, a familiar face walked through the door. Mr. Henderson, dressed in his usual understated manner, entered with a quiet smile. The room fell silent for a moment before breaking into more applause. Mr. Henderson approached Brian, extending his hand. "I heard there was a celebration," he said warmly. "I couldn't miss it." Brian shook his hand, his grip firm but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for coming, sir, and for everything else." Mr. Henderson chuckled softly. "Don't thank me, Brian. You did the hard work. I just gave you the opportunity." They stood together for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling between them. Finally, Mr. Henderson patted Brian's shoulder. "Go make your mark, son. I have no doubt you'll do great things." As the evening wound down, Brian left the restaurant with a mix of emotions: sadness to leave a place that had become home, but excitement for the future ahead. He looked back one last time, the glow of the neon sign reflected in his eyes, and whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." And it was. Brian's new location thrived under his leadership, becoming a model for respect and kindness in the community. He never forgot where he started, or the lessons that shaped him. For Mr. Henderson, Brian became a symbol of why second chances mattered, proof that even the smallest moments of humility could spark a transformation that changed lives forever. The story ended not just with Brian's success, but with a legacy, a reminder that respect, once given, could ripple far beyond a single person, creating waves of change in the world.